Hello everyone, welcome to another casual chat with Rupert August, Kurtz, Simon, and Henry. Did I change the order again? Is that the third different order that we've used, or...?
The important thing is we're all here.
Well, yes, but...
Were you doing top to bottom that time?
Yeah, sure, why not? Anyway, today we are talking about London. None of us like it, and so we're going to discuss why.
Shit.
Alright, that's a good start. So...
It's a glorified city-state at this point.
In a lot of ways, yes. But
It's loud and it smells.
Too crowded.
Alright, let's go on to
Too
some
many brown
more
people.
structured points about this, because my personal peeve about it, in a more tangible way, I suppose, is the way that it's kind of built on top of itself, and that's often seen as a plus by a lot of people, in the way that it's kind of had an organic development, but it's not been entirely organic, I wouldn't say, because it's always been sort of structured around whatever sort of styles or business interests or whatever, or tastes are like coming through at the time. And so what it means is that the skyline, and particularly when you walk through certain areas, is just a complete abomination of like different mishmashes of architectural styles, and it just gives the whole place a kind of
Yeah, the whole place is a
feel
bit
about
of
it.
Sorry.
No, sorry, go on.
The whole place is a bit of just like a I mean, it's just an assault on the senses.
Yeah, a lot of the time. And so, although it may be heresy, I do actually prefer Paris in some ways, anyway, because the I think you pronounce his name Haussmann. The Haussmann renovations mean that at least everything is in a fairly consistent style, and I would much prefer that if other cities are like that. Same goes for the I can't remember what it's called now, but the triangle of cities that consists of is it Budapest, Prague. Budapest, Prague, Vienna, and to a lesser extent Bratislava are all kind of like in that similar sort of style, because they were all built up at similar times, and so they have a very distinctive style about them, and that's one that's kind of continued to be maintained up through today. So, for example, Budapest gets a lot of praise because of the way that it's tried to maintain its aesthetic, but that's only really possible in an environment where you already have a consistent aesthetic, i.e. neoclassical in that sense, I believe, in that regard, I believe.
So basically, these cities just have like a almost like a building standard code where they just are like, we'd like your buildings to look as close to this as possible, just so everything stays kind of cohesive.
Yeah, basically. But I think it comes more down to the public buildings more than anything, really. So, things like when there's new town halls or new courthouses and things being built, then they're all built to that consistent style, because that's coming from more of a political perspective rather than it being designed privately. But they may also have incredibly strict requirements, I guess, for anything that's being built in the city centre that has a lot of oversight to make sure that you can't just throw up any old building.
I think Bath does it quite well, if we're looking for a more local example.
Yeah, to a limited extent, Birmingham would also be an example of a more consistent aesthetic, or even Manchester and Liverpool, although both of those are in slightly more of a state of disrepair. Because, again, the thing there is that they received a lot of their money and investment in a relatively short period of time, which meant that a lot of different buildings were all being thrown up at a time when the styles were kind of, there was like certain styles in, so you get like more of a consistent style because there's generally just like a popular style of building at the time.
So I wouldn't exactly say that any consistent style is a good style.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's the other thing I was going to say, is that everything, Soviet cities are also abominations.
Well, in the city where I live, we've got some pretty... What's the word? I can't remember what era it is. It's the big like concrete tower blocks.
Blaming
that's-
brutalism.
That just stick out like sore thumbs.
That's
And there's like a law courts building, which is the same sort of thing.
A lot of cement rectangles, essentially.
Yeah.
So not all consistency is a good thing. Just consistency with any sort of vague sense of aesthetics.
Yes, so I probably should have stated that at the outset, but that is probably more important I would probably prefer it if they were mixing up styles that were all pleasant styles, like aesthetic styles in London, but they've got a little bit of everything. But additionally, on top of that, you can take several good styles, smash them all together, and it creates something pretty ugly, I would say.
Yeah, like ideally, I think what you'd want is, I'm just going to use an example of like the Gothic style of architecture.
Yeah, neo-Gothic.
And if everything was just, and fair enough if like when you start building everything, it's all in Gothic style, but then styles change slightly. As long as it's kind of like still an offshoot of that Gothic style, it will probably still remain quite consistent. But for some reason, London just decides, no, we're going to do something completely different. And so even if those buildings would be fine in a vacuum, as much as I'm not really a fan of those, like, I call them I just call them glass abominations, ones where it's like, how many fucking windows do you need in that building? But yeah, London has this such like mismatch and everything, and these individual buildings would probably look fine on their own. They're not unappealing, but because they're just plonked next to an older building and that's in a completely different style, it's like, what the hell are you doing?
It is as if they are trying to be, what's the word, as contradictory as possible in the architectural style. So like,
it feels like they're kind of like, it gets to a point where you start seeing it and you're like, okay, now you're just spitting in the face of the dead architects at this point.
Well, some of the more recent styles are at least semi-deliberately that, when you're talking about like a style being, subversive to expectations or something in some of the postmodern and modernist styles. So there's I'm sure you can find a gallery of them where it's some kind of like old. I think it might have been at the Frankfurt Art Museum or something, I want to say, where they've got this old building that it's fine. It's nothing. I wouldn't say that there's anything particularly wowing about it. But then they've built this kind of explosion of glass coming out of the side of it with all like sharp angles and it just looks like a mess. I think that must be the intention, because it does just look like half of the building has exploded and then been encased in glass or crystal or something. But it's just an assault on the eyes. That has to be intentional.
I mean, I feel like we're all leading towards the same point here, that this is all done, or at least seems to be done, with the purpose of just completely destroying the area's sense of unity and belonging. It doesn't match any style. There's no consistency there, and so it's difficult to.
They're basically just. I mean, all they have to do now is just start renaming the buildings and the street names, and it's the book that everybody references.
I mean, that kind of touches on something else that's a bit of a problem about the glass abominations that we talked about, that's just entirely window, is that it's completely transferable and transferred everywhere. That there's no sense of cultural belonging there, because it's just identical anywhere you go. It makes the skylines of all of these different cities look effectively the same as one another, because they're all just filled with rectangular, like skyscrapers, like window-based skyscrapers. Nothing else there. It's just windows all the way up.
Rupert, you can have slightly different shaped glass dildos.
Yeah, some of them don't even turn into death rays that melt people's cars. But yeah, Rupert, that's exactly what I was trying to say. Except you put it a hell of a lot more eloquently.
Completely uprooted from culture and such.
Yeah.
I was actually looking recently at one of the original proposals for I can't remember if it was the rebuilding of the Reichstag or the original building of the Reichstag in Germany. But it was just this massive cathedral-looking sort of neo-Gothic, complete with spires, and it captures a very different feel, and I can't imagine that being, I don't know, out in Nigeria.
Yeah, I feel like we're getting stuck on architecture here, and we've sort of all run out of things to say. Do we want to move this on to some other point of contention?
Well, what I feel like we're finally getting to, because we're talking about how these the glass abominations, as apparently we're coining them now, are lacking in any kind of like cultural origin. And so because of that, it's kind of like, it's one of these things where I would actually go out of my way to say that London just doesn't have a culture at all anymore.
I mean, this goes for a lot of cities more generally, though, especially just in terms of the people and the ideas that get floated around. It's just this idea.
Yeah, but I feel like London is like a genuine poster child for that, because comparing it to like any other big city out there, like New York has these districts that seem to have their own culture, at least, you know, like differences between New York City and New Jersey, etc.
Yeah, but even that is all sort of commodified and commercialized in itself. I mean, the whole idea of Harlem being overtaken by hipsters because they want something that's basically been commodified and sold to them as like an image that they're trying to take part in by, you know, being able to say that they live in Harlem and being around it, even though they crowd out that phenomenon in itself by all being there, and thus Harlem becomes something completely different from what it used to be. And that's just that, to me, that epitomizes the problem. So sure, you can live in like I don't know, is Soho even a place that people live? I'm not sure. Or is it just a commercial district? Either way, you know, if you were to go to Soho and to take part in it, I imagine the amount of tourists who are trying to get the Soho experience is now vastly crowding out the amount of people who are actually, you know, taking part in the Soho experience and producing it.
Yeah.
So
Which
it's
I
all
think,
just been kind of like commodified out of existence. But sorry, go on.
Well, I'm not sure if it's. I don't know if I'd say that that's the main root cause of of what we're sort of talking about. I think this is a bit moving on to the next point, but I think the fact that there isn't really one ethnic people or like one continuous group that's been living in London, it really hasn't helped matters. If not, it's the cause of what we're talking about now. The fact that most of the people that live in London were not, you know, their grandparents weren't born or lived in London. They were born or lived even in the country is a bit much to ask.
It's an entire city of vagabonds. It's just most of the people who live in London are not from London. They've come from all over the country or all over the world, and so they don't have this unifying idea of a culture or a community there. That's the root issue.
Except when it's transiently created in, you know, however long they've actually been there, which just happens to be a conglomeration of all the people who just, again, happen to end up there. That is what London culture is usually referred to as now, you know, when you're talking about like a multiplicity or a diversity, which is a description of nothing.
Also, I feel like it needs to be kind of stated as well that it's not just that it's so many people, so many different groups of people, it's also so many different groups of people that arrived pretty much all at once, so there wasn't anything for them to like assimilate into.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly not helpful, but I mean, going back to the point that I was making earlier, I don't necessarily think this is a phenomenon that's unique to London. I would say that it applies to almost any European city in particular, but across the world mostly, is that they've all just kind of become this generic cosmopolis that has multiple different outlets, but it all just kind of feeds into the same, I hesitate to say machine, but I guess this same kind of organism, the same phenomenon of the cosmopolis, and there's just like different parts of it all over the place. You know, so I guess if you were going to explore the cosmopolis, then you could, you know, take a stop off at Paris, and that would be one district of the cosmopolis. You could stop off at London, you could stop off at Frankfurt, you could stop off at Berlin, and you would not be able to tell that much between them, other than the superficial differences of language and you know, whatever ruins of the city that used to be there happen to still be around.
You heard it here first. Rupert says language is superficial.
I didn't mean like that, but, you know, superficial in the sense that it's not really colouring the underlying culture anymore, because the ideas that are like underneath all of that have been so homogenized.
I mean, you're also assuming that the people who are in these cities actually speak the native language of the country at all.
I know, a bold assumption of me.
Yeah, I think so. I've been to a lot of those cities, and I do think that definitely rings true, at least in my experience. Just this idea of that yeah, there isn't really much to a city other than, oh look, it's a city. So I lived in Bristol. I went to university in Bristol for a little while. It's literally all shops. There's no culture to the city at all. It's just a lot of people and a big place. About it.
Right, so this could just as easily be renamed as why we hate just cities in general, as opposed to London specifically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, there's any London-specific issues anyone would like to bring up.
I think the aesthetic issues we spoke about at first were fairly London specific. I think a lot of other cities are at least better for it.
Yeah. So in most other cities, I described it as ruins, but so all of the architecture that was, for example, built in one place, even though the people who built it and the kind of what motivated them is now gone. In that regard, is what I mean by referring to them as ruins, because all of that core sort of infrastructure is still there, but the actual people and the culture of the city is almost indistinguishable from what it was then.
I also think the reason why I have a particular disdain for London in particular is, and this is maybe, funnily enough, as much as I just said London doesn't have a culture, what the kind of artificial culture that London is trying to project is just so aggravating to just hear because of how much they... I'm just going to say it, fucking auto-filate themselves over the whole thing, being like, oh, look how amazing we are, and it's like, your city's shit, dude.
Well, I mean, to give the devil his due, they do produce something like 10% of the UK GDP, and like just in London alone, and they have a relatively significant amount of the population. I can't remember exactly how much it is, but it's
8 million people live in London. To put that into perspective, 5 million people live in all of Scotland.
Yeah.
And 60 million in all of England. I think, what is it, 66? No, it's 60 million in England, and that's including London. So,
yeah,
52 million.
Was it even more then? Because that would put their GDP per capita exactly the same as the UK, which is wrong. Because that would mean that they'd be about 10% of the population and also about 10% of the GDP. So maybe I'm understating it. It might be, it must be even higher than that. But I won't look it up just now.
Mm.
So yes, it's in terms of absolute metrics, it's very important to the UK as a whole. But spiritually and like in terms of culture, it's an absolute wasteland.
I know that obviously economy and things like that is important, but I feel like, as you say, the whole spiritual and cultural wasteland that it is, I feel like that's a much longer term problem than it's a much longer term problem that I dislike, to the point where I feel like it really outweighs the good of the economic prosperity that they bring.
Yeah, it completely skews the politics of the whole situation as well. So it means that, quite famously, London ends up being the focus of a lot of policy, vastly disproportionately. Not least because all of the politicians are actually there on a regular basis, and so they're more likely to come into contact with those issues directly. But also just because when so many of these news agencies or whatever, and a lot of media outlets and such are based out of London, for example, I'm sure the BBC, by London standards, are actually fairly moderate and in the middle of most of the issues they talk about. But compared to the rest of the country, they are not at all.
That disturbs me more than ever, really.
I mean, that's pure speculation. I have no data to back me up on that. It's just, based on the propensities of what people I know who are in and around London.
Yeah, but still horrifying thought, really.
I mean, there's definitely something about cities in general that seems to make them a lot more left-leaning.
Right. Yeah, that's a big thing as well. The general. I mean, I would probably take this back to the cosmopolis thing if I'm trying to be reductionist and bring it all around to a single point, but. Yeah, like you say, there does seem to be more of a kind of materialistic and left-wing angle that is generated by cities.
I think maybe it's I think it's a bit more of this like materialistic outlook that you get when you're when you're sort of so focused on commerce in general, like when you're reliant on just supermarkets and big brands, you tend not to really think about the sort of value behind everything. It's all money. All the commodity.
Right. So, one thing that I've seen that is kind of a different way of stating that in, I guess, more philosophical terms, is that when people are in the cities, they have much less of a concept of how things like money translate into actual goods. And so it just becomes a case of, if you have money, then you have access to goods, because goods are just available. Goods and services are just available, and it's just a matter of being able to get money. Which can, fool you into thinking that any any lack of being able to get access to those goods and services is just them not having money. Whereas if you're more out in the countryside, then you have more of a hands-on, approach to how goods and services are either produced or moved. Even is quite a simple thing. But if you're in logistics, then you have some more of an idea as to how difficult it is and how expensive it is and time-consuming, etc. to just move things around. It doesn't all just appear on your shelf. And so that closer relationship with the actual, supply side of the economy is one of the things that, from a materialist economic perspective, would draw somebody to more of a supply side economic perspective, and wanting to not just make sure that everyone has more money, because money isn't specie. Money, like just giving everyone cash, is not going to create more goods. You can't be fooled into thinking that in the same way.
I'm going to be bluntly honest. When I said it, I believe I said it earlier, that I see London kind of like as a city-state, and I still feel that way, where I don't even really recognise it as being England, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, this is something that I'm sure everyone here has seen John Cleese's speech that he did about how London is no longer an English city.
Yeah.
It's something that I wish I had rewatched before we had done this, but still, it's he raises a lot of valid points that he was criticised for, basically just for going against the grain. So yeah, everything that makes a city English has been sort of sandblasted away from London. It's just this international city. It's got no identity. People there have got no culture, no community. There's not even a cohesion in its architectural style. It is just a big mishmash of different cultures and aesthetics and ideas that has led to it being this grey sludge of a city.
Yeah, as much as people want to celebrate it as diverse, and it's like ticks me off, because then it's like your idea of diversity is everyone to be a grey blob, basically.
Well, it's fine, because everything is oriented quite well towards just making more money. That's the consistency of the city now. That's the only through line.
I think the important thing to consider, I suppose, just playing devil's advocate at this point, though, is that this is what the city appears like from the outside perspective. But I'm sure there are, pockets of like communities and cultures. That's not including things like the bloody Chinatown and I think I can't remember if it is just like Soho or if it's Koreatown, but where they're fucking literally just one community of Chinese and Korean people that just sit in the city and just make it little bits of their own land. I'm talking more in terms of like what's left of the Londoners, because they are still there. They're just sort of a bit scattered about.
As far as I know, most of them moved out. There's a small Cockney diaspora in Essex, as far as I know. But other than that,
I mean, as far as I'm aware, the only thing that is left of a true London culture is teenagers selling drugs to each other and killing each other. So
Yikes.
that and little Chinatowns, if you want to go and get yourself some fried rice or whatever.
Some taiyaki.
I thought you were going to go in a completely different direction with that. I was thinking opium. Call back to the good old days.
God.
Don't we all miss the nemesis?
An obscure history reference for the viewers there.
I mean, my issue then with even with that devil's advocacy is the fact that these groups really do seem to like enclave themselves really hard, like they don't interact much with each other at all.
Yeah,
which kind of goes against this whole like melting pot idea, and in fact seems to cause more long-term problems, because then if you happen to have two enclaves that are close to each other and historically and ethnically speaking they've always disliked each other, then you're just going to have violence erupt between them constantly.
Yeah, that's the whole problem with this whole sort of like enclaves of cultures existing. It's not even that it is necessary. I'm sure there are pockets of a quote-unquote London culture that still exists or is unique to the city. But these idea of these little Chinatowns or Koreatowns and stuff, it's not that it is a unique London culture. It is just a culture that has been transplanted from another place and just snipped out and dropped in the middle of London. And that as Simon said rightly, just probably causes more issues more than anything else. It's not making the city more diverse, it's just creating these little pockets where where someone's going to feel unwelcome. Like, as an Englishman, do you feel welcome in a little Chinatown?
It's not even necessarily a problem for English people in London, where the issue arises if you have one group that is particularly very angry. I say angry. Particularly very hostile towards other groups. And the thing is that these people, they're not stupid people. That's the thing. Is like they know better than to go after the native population because we make up the majority, and attacking the majority is usually a bad thing. And what never gets reported on is how
London.
Yeah, in London.
No, London is not majority English anymore.
No, but I'm saying as if I'm talking about like English majorities and across all of England.
Right. Okay.
Because attacking the majority of any country is usually not a good idea unless that country is completely cucked. Let's be perfectly honest.
Like London.
But what gets annoying is that what's never reported on is how one ethnic group will one cultural group will go after a load of other cultural groups that are just smaller than them, and it never gets reported on. And then when people talk about how particularly nasty that group is, people just don't believe it because it's like, well, it's not. They haven't attacked any English people, and it's weirdly the most like. As much as these people say tolerance and everything, it's like it's weirdly the most racist thing I've seen.
Well, can't really claim this as anything more than a rumour, but from what I've heard, the Muslim rape gangs ended up predating on Sikhs before they moved over to English girls. So that would be, if it's true, an example of what you're talking about. Or some of the roving street battles that they've been having over on the continent more recently, particularly in France. So there was one very recently in Dijon between, basically a race war between Chechens and Algerians. Race war is a bit strong, maybe, but you know what I mean. Like, ethnically...
it's a race kerfuffle.
A race kerfuffle, there you go. A race skirmish.
A race barroom brawl.
Except in the street with guns and using cars as weapons.
Trucks.
Yeah, let's go back to war.
But yeah, point being. Oh, actually, no, there was another one more recently as well in London. Between Pakistanis and Indians. I think it was for the Indian independence this year, like the anniversary of it, where there was a bunch of Pakistanis that showed up to attack the Indian delegation. That was having like a little street party thing going on.
But as London will say, nothing to see here, people. We're all a diverse, happy little melting pot. Nothing bad ever happens here.
It's just pass and parcel of living in a big city. What about that don't you get?
I mean, I know this is kind of like a side point, but this is also why I have an absolute revulsion for the mayor of London, because he just, anytime something really bad happens, and it consistently happens, he just basically turns around and says, "Oh, this is things Londoners have to just live with."
No, this is why pretty much everyone fucking hates the mayor of London at the moment, is that he typifies everything that's wrong with the city. Anytime there is a massive problem that is very much like a London problem, like all the stabbings that go on there, or all the terrorist attacks and things like that, his response is always just like, that's just what it's like living in London. Oh, man, and if you try and link this back to race, you're a piece of shit. Now cover up all those billboards that attract women.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know why anyone expected any different from a man who made his career out of defending terrorists.
Oof. Shots fired.
Yeah.
It's not like the good old days where Boris would come on down a fucking zip line waving a couple of Union Jacks like an absolute madman.
And make a massive bungle look triumphant.
It's his speciality.
Yeah.
I think we're getting onto a wider topic here. I don't know if we want to talk about it, about just the state of Western culture at the moment, because that's what we seem to be talking about, is like multiculturalism, weird left wing.
Well, as I was going to say, it seems awfully broad, but then again, I can't help but feel like we've kind of drained this London-specific area of conversation dry.
True.
Somewhat, but I mean, if we are going to talk about the wider problems, then almost all of that is down to the cities. It all comes from the cities, it's manufactured, and and gains life from the cities, almost none of the things that they say are relevant outside the cities most of the time. So
also, when you say it's broad and things like this, like this applies to more than London. Well, we're just kind of using London as an example, I suppose. And also just the fact that, like, if there's, I mean, that kind of just tells you how bad the problem is if London isn't the only example of this.
Yeah, I mean, if we were a bunch of Frenchmen, we'd probably be speaking this way about Paris, or if we were Germans, we'd probably be speaking this way of Berlin. You know, we happen to be speaking of London because we're Englishmen.
Berlin's interesting, though. Well, I mean, I think London is probably the same in different regards, but yeah, no, they definitely are actually. But Berlin is interesting because it's been degenerate for so long. Like it was famous during the Weimar years for being just a hive of scum and villainy as well. Except, for slightly different reasons a lot of the time. Now it's full of hipsters rather than prostitutes and drugs. Although it does also have those.
Man, talk about a win-win.
What's the win with the hipsters?
I was being sarcastic, Henry.
Alright.
Thank you for making me explain my joke.
This kills the joke. Alright. Well, I mean, that seems like a pretty good place to leave this for now, then. Maybe we can come back to some of the wider problems with Western trajectory, culture? I don't know, however we want to phrase that. Next time?
Yeah, next time.
Yeah, cities suck, and if anyone comes from a city and tries to spread their cringeworthy ways, then you must refute them all the way.
Yeah, we need to build a wall. Not to any other country, but, to the cities.
We must build a wall and we will make the cities pay for it.
Literally. Goods can
Be
come
like
in and
a
out, but
reverse.
everything else has to stay inside.
Be like a reverse Diocletian where you're trying to stop anything getting out of the cities.
Exactly. Gotta try and quarantine them.
Hmm.
Anyway. Goodbye then.